The Lives of the Saints by the Reverend Alban Butler, taken from the 4th edition, published in 1954. January 1st. Saint Fulgentius, Bishop and Confessor. Fabius Claudius Gordianus Fulgentius was the descendant of a noble senatorian family of Carthage, but much decayed in its splendor by the invasion of the Vandals. His father Claudius, being unjustly deprived of his house in Carthage, which was made over to the Arian priests, settled at an estate belonging to him at Telepte, the capital city of the province of Byzacena. Our saint was born in 468, about 30 years after the barbarians had dismembered Africa from the Roman Empire. He was educated in sentiments of piety with his younger brother under the care of his mother Mariana, who was left a young widow. Being by her particular direction taught the Greek very young, he spoke it with as proper and exact an accent as if it had been his native language. He also applied himself to Latin and all the useful parts of human literature under masters distinguished for consummate abilities, yet he knew how to mingle business with study, for he took upon himself the regulation of the family concerns in order to ease his mother of the burden. His prudent circumspection in all the affairs he transacted, his virtuous conduct, his mild carriage to all, and more especially his deference for his mother, without whose express orders or approbation he never did anything, caused him to be beloved and admired wherever his name was known. He was chosen procurator, that is, lieutenant governor, and general receiver of the taxes of Byzacena. But it was not long before he grew disgusted with the world, and being justly alarmed at its dangers, he armed himself against them by pious readings, assiduous prayer, and rigorous fasting. His visits to monasteries were frequent, and happening, among other books of spiritual entertainment, to read a sermon of St. Austin on the 36th Psalm, in which that father treats of the world and the short duration of human life, he felt within him strong desires of embracing the monastic state. Huneric, the Arian king, had driven most of the Orthodox bishops from their sees. One of these, named Faustus, had erected a monastery in Byzacena. It was to him that the young nobleman addressed himself for admittance. But Faustus, immediately objecting the tenderness of his constitution, discouraged his desires with words of some harshness. "Go," said he, "and first learn to live in the world abstracted from its pleasures. Who can well suppose that you, on a sudden, relinquishing a life of softness and ease, can take up with our coarse diet and clothing, and can inure yourself to our watchings and fastings?" The saint, with downcast eyes, modestly replied, "He who hath inspired me with a will to serve him, can also furnish me with courage and strength." This humble yet resolute answer induced Faustus to admit on trial. The saint was then in the 22nd year of his age. The news of so unthought of an event both surprised and edified the whole country. Many even imitated the example of the governor. But Mariana, his mother, in transports of grief, ran to the monastery, crying out at the gates, "Faustus, restore to me my son, to the people their governor. The church always protects widows. Why then rob you me, a desolate widow, of my son?" She persisted several days in the same tears and cries. Nothing that Faustus could urge was sufficient to calm her, or prevail with her to depart without her son. This was certainly as great a trial of Fulgentius's resolution as it could well be put to, but the love of God, having the ascendant in his breast, gave him a complete victory over all the suggestions of nature. Faustus approved his vocation, and accordingly recommended him to the brethren. The saint, having now obtained all he wished for in this world, made over his estates to his mother, to be discretionally disposed of by her in favor of his brother, as soon as he should be arrived at proper age. He totally abstained from oil and everything savory, from wine also, drinking only water. His mortifications brought on him a dangerous illness, yet after recovery he abated nothing in them. The persecution breaking out anew, Faustus was obliged to withdraw, and our saint with his consent repaired to a neighboring monastery, of which Felix, the abbot, would fain resign to him the government. Fulgentius was much startled at the proposal, but at length was prevailed upon to consent that they should jointly execute the functions. It was admirable to observe with what harmony these two holy abbots for 6 years governed the house. No contradiction ever took place between them. Each always contended to comply with the will of his colleague. Felix undertook the management of the temporal concerns. Fulgentius's province was to preach and instruct. In the year 499, the country being ravaged by an eruption of the Numidians, the two abbots were necessitated to fly to Sicca Veneria, a city of the proconsular province of Africa. Here it was that an Arian priest ordered them to be apprehended and scourged on account of their preaching the consubstantiality of the Son of God. Felix, seeing the executioners seized first on Fulgentius, cried out, "Spare that poor brother of mine, whose delicate complexion cannot bear torments. Let them rather be my portion, who am strong of body." They accordingly, at the instigation of this wicked priest, fell on Felix first, and the old man endured their stripes with the greatest alacrity. When it was Fulgentius' turn to experience the same rigorous treatment, he bore the lashes with great patience, but feeling the pain excessive, that he might gain a little respite and recruit his spirits, he requested his judge to give ear to something he had to impart to him. The executioners, thereupon being commanded to desist, he began to entertain him with an account of his travels. This savage monster expected nothing more than some overtures to be proposed to him of an intention to yield, but finding himself disappointed in the utmost rage, ordered his torments to be redoubled. At length, having glutted his barbarity, the confessors were dismissed, their clothes rent, their bodies inhumanly torn, and their beards and hair plucked off. The very Arians were ashamed of such cruelty, and their bishop offered to punish the priest if Fulgentius would but undertake his prosecution. His answer was that a Christian is never allowed to seek revenge, and for their part it was incumbent on them not to lose the advantage of patience and the blessings accruing from the forgiving of injuries. The two abbots, to avoid an additional effort of the fury of these heretics, traveled to Ididi, on the confines of Mauritania. Here Fulgentius went aboard a ship for Alexandria, being desirous for the sake of greater perfection to visit the deserts of Egypt, renowned for the sanctity of the solitaries who dwelt there. But the vessel touching at Sicily, St. Eudalius, abbot at Syracuse, diverted him from his intended voyage, on assuring him that a perfidious dissension had severed his country from the communion of Peter, meaning that Egypt was full of heretics, with whom those that dwelt there were obliged either to join in communion or be deprived of the sacraments. The liberality and hospitality of Fulgentius to the poor, out of the small pittance he received for his particular subsistence, made Eudalius condemn himself of remissness in those virtues, and for the future imitate so laudable an example. Our saint, having laid aside the thoughts of pursuing his voyage to Alexandria, embarked for Rome, to offer up his prayers at the tombs of the apostles. Fulgentius returned home in a short time after, and was received with incredible joy. He built a spacious monastery in Bezetsaina, but retired to a cell himself, which was situate on the seashore. Here his time was employed in writing, reading, prayer, mortification, and manual labor of making mats and umbrellas of palm tree leaves. Faustus, who was his bishop, obliged him to resume the government of his monastery, and many places at the same time sought him for their bishop. King Thrasimund, having prohibited by edict the ordination of orthodox bishops, several sees by this means had been long vacant and destitute of pastors. The orthodox prelates resolved to remedy this inconveniency, as they effectually did. But the king, receiving intelligence of the matter, caused Victor, the primate of Carthage, to be apprehended. All this time our saint lay concealed, though sought after eagerly by many citizens for their bishop. Thinking the danger over, he appeared again. But Ruspa, now a little town called Alfacis, in its district of Tunis, still remained without a pastor, and by the consent of the primate, whilst detained in the custody of the king's messenger, Fulgentius was forcibly taken out of his cell and consecrated bishop in 508. His new dignity made no alteration in his manners. He never wore the orarium, a kind of stole then used by bishops, nor other clothes than his usual coarse garb, which was the same in winter and summer. He went sometimes barefoot. He never undressed to take rest, and always rose to prayer before the midnight, contented himself salting the palate's gratification by borrowed tastes. But in more advanced years, finding his sight impaired by such a regimen, he admitted the use of a little oil. It was only in very considerable bodily indispositions that he suffered a drop or two of wine to be mingled with water with which he drank, and he never could be prevailed upon in any seeming necessity to use the least quantity of flesh meat, from the time of his monastic profession till his death. His modesty, meekness, and humility gained him the affections of all, even of the ambitious deacon Felix, who had opposed his election, and whom the saint received and treated with the most cordial charity. His great love for a recluse life induced him to build a monastery near his own house at Ruspa, which he designed to put under the direction of his ancient friend Felix. But before the building could be completed, or he acquit himself to his wish of his episcopal duties, orders were issued from King Thrasimund for his banishment to Sardinia, with others to the number of 60 orthodox bishops. Fulgentius, though the youngest of this venerable body who were transported from Carthage to Sardinia, was notwithstanding their sole oracle in all doubts, and their tongue and pen upon all occasions, and not only of them, but even of the whole Church of Africa. Pope Symmachus, out of his pastoral care and charity, sent every year provisions and money and clothes to these champions of Christ. A letter of this pope to them is still extant, in which he encourages and comforts them, and it was at the same time that he sent them relics of Saints Nazarius and Romanus, that the example and patronage, as he expresses it, of those generous soldiers of Christ might animate the confessors to fight valiantly the battles of the Lord. St. Fulgentius, with some companions, converted his house at Cagliari into a monastery, which immediately became the comfort of all in affliction, the refuge of the poor, and the oracle to which the whole country resorted for deciding their controversies without appeal. In this retirement, the saint composed many learned treatises for confirming and instructing the faithful in Africa. King Thrasimund, hearing that he was their principal support and their invincible advocate, was desirous of seeing him, and having accordingly sent for him, appointed him lodgings in Carthage. The king then drew up a set of objections to which he required an immediate answer. The saint, without hesitation, complied with and discharged the injunction, and this is supposed to be his book entitled An Answer to 10 Objections. The king equally admired his humility and learning, and the Orthodox triumphed exceedingly in the advantage their cause gained by this peace. To prevent a second time the same effect, the king, when he sent him a new objection, ordered them to be only read to him. Fulgentius refused to give an answer in writing, unless he was allowed to take a copy of them. He addressed, however, to the king an ample and modest confutation of Arianism, which we have under the title of his 3 books to King Thrasimund. The prince was pleased with the work, and granted him permission to reside at Carthage, till upon repeated complaints from the Arian bishops of the success of his preaching, which threatened, they said, a total extinction of their sect in Carthage, he was sent back to Sardinia in 520. Being ready to go aboard the ship, he said to a Catholic whom he saw weeping, "Grieve not, Juliatus," for that was his name. "I shall shortly return, and we shall see the true faith of Christ flourishing again in this kingdom, with full liberty to profess it, but divulge not this secret to any." The event confirmed the truth of the prediction. King Thrasimund died in 523, having nominated Hilderic his successor. Knowing him inclined to favor the Orthodox, he exacted from him an oath that he would never restore their profession. To evade this, Hilderic, before the death of his professor, signed an order for the liberty of the Orthodox churches, but never had the courage to declare himself of the same belief, his lenity having quite degenerated into softness and indolence. However, the professors of the true faith called home their pastors. The ship which brought them back was received at Carthage with the greatest demonstrations of joy. The shore echoed far and near with repeated acclamations, more particularly when Fulgentius appeared on the upper deck of the vessel. The confessors went straight to the church of St. Agilius to return thanks to God, and were accompanied by thousands. But on their way, being surprised with a sudden storm, the people, to show their singular regard for Fulgentius, made a kind of umbrella over his head with their cloaks to defend him from the inclemency of the storm. The saint hastened to his own church, and immediately set about the reformation of the abuses that had crept in during the persecution, which had now continued 70 years. But this reformation was carried on with a sweetness that won sooner or later the hearts of the most vicious. In a council held at Junque in 524, a certain bishop, named Quod Vult Deus, disputed the precedency with our saint, who made no reply, though he would not oppose the council, which ordered him to take the first place. The other resented this as an injury offered to the dignity of his see, and St. Fulgentius, in another council soon after, publicly requested that Quod Vult Deus might be allowed the precedency. He bore the violent pains of his last illness for 70 days with admirable patience, having this prayer almost always in his mouth: "Lord, grant me patience now, and hereafter mercy and pardon." The physicians advised him the use of baths, to whom he answered, "Can baths make a mortal man escape death, when his life is arrived at its final period?" He would abate nothing of his usual austerities, without an absolute necessity. In his agony, calling for his clergy and monks, who were all in tears, he begged pardon if he had ever offended any of them. He comforted them, gave them some short, moving instructions, and calmly breathed forth his pious soul in the year 533, and of his age the 65th, on the 1st of January, on which day his name occurs in many calendars soon after his death, and in the Roman, but in some few on the 16th of May, perhaps the day on which his relics were translated to Bourges in France about the year 714, where they still remain deposited. His disciple relates that Poncian, a neighboring bishop, was assured in a vision of his glorious immortality. The veneration for his virtues was such that he was interred within the church, contrary to the law and custom of that age, as is remarked by the author of his life. St. Fulgentius proposed to himself St. Austin for a model, and as a true disciple imitated him in his conduct, faithfully expounding his doctrine and imbibing his spirit.